The behavior that birthed IMC wasn't a banner. It was a design choice. Build a digital black hole that anomalies couldn't escape. Biology flags in the pipes to love gravity more than by the early 2000s, the language turned clinical while the rooms got colder. The appendices started whispering about classes instead of names. That's how Crown slid in, soft, lowercase in the schema editor, no fanfare. Then a number tree unfolded behind it like rungs on a ladder. Class 42 Crown wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a containment profile, nitrogen flow rate, vibration tolerance, tamper flags, and a note that felt like a dare: co-locate with data node, replicate before transit. Meanwhile, the jokes in the lab changed. Off-book couriers who used to crack wise about coffee now joked about vapor. No chain, no claim, they'd say, watching nitrogen plumes curl from a crate like breath in winter. It sounded flippant until you stepped into a loading bay at 2 a.m. and saw the real choreography. Blue-lit carts, thermal gloves, a label printer that spoke in codes instead of words. The tech spoke in codes too. "Crown rows are fat tonight," one muttered, then grinned like it was a weather report. Our steward never touched the crates. He touched the edges of the story they told. A single shipping manifest slipped into his view one week when a routing ticket misfiled it to his queue. Everything that should have been blacked out was blacked out. Consignee, handler names, facility ID. What stayed were the numbers that mattered: weight, shock profile, interior temp telemetry slaved to a sensor he'd never seen before. The readout held at a narrow band, so steady it felt like a machine holding a breath. If you were moving old parts, you could be sloppy. This looked like someone moving something that hated being warm. Unknown to them, across town, building access was changing shape. The wet labs that people dismissed as rumor became doors that responded to bodies, not badges. Iris plus gate. Stand there, look here, walk 5 paces again. Inside those labs, a data node hummed so close to the benches that you could rest a hand on the rack and feel the same heartbeat you felt if you touched the freezer. The message was simple: data and matter live together, or not at all. Replicate the bits before you replicate the cold. From his perspective, Crown went from a ghost word to a maintenance ticket when someone misrouted a notification. 42 Crown replicate failed. He'd saved that phrase like a pebble. Now the ticket spelled out the behavior. Primary write succeeded. Mirror failed integrity check at byte 3,681,920. He knew that number would be meaningless to anyone else. To him, it mapped to a block size he'd seen only on write-once optical arrays. If you were trying to keep something untouched, you'd write it to glass before you wrote it to convenience. The stakes rose because denial had to wrestle with receipts. Public-facing offices still said there was no single repository. Yet internal maintenance tickets kept citing a shared schema for Crown: version like code, patch like code, pushed out with notes like stabilize Coral checksum tolerance. Coral. There was that substitution again, the system swapping Crown for something more polite. He wrote the patch numbers down on a card and didn't carry the card outside. Meanwhile, the 11-page filing that would land on a house table wasn't out yet, but its language lived in his terminal. Non-human material handling existed as a clause in the SP, and now as a field in a form a junior admin would never see. The taxonomy mapped cleanly. If Crown hits 42, route to wet lab co-located node. If integrity fails, replicate until Coral parity confirmed. If parity fails twice, halt transit and escalate to parent. He didn't need a definition of non-human to understand what a system does when it pretends a definition doesn't exist. You watch behavior. Here's where a small human moment told him more than 100 pages. The lab tech who'd sent that late-night buzz walked past him in a corridor and nodded the way people nod when they share a secret by accident. He asked a nothing question about climate sensors. The tech said, "We don't chase room temp, we chase object temp," then saw his own words land and smiled too brightly. That one sentence rewired the stakes. You only chase object temp if you're keeping an object alive enough to measure. While that was happening in the basement, upstairs, policy people shifted chairs. A maintenance calendar added a new quarter-over-quarter job. Update biology flags, test iris plus gate calibration, verify nitrogen alarm routings. It was housekeeping if you lived in a house that stored weather. And buried in a change log, a line tied the human and the machine. Add MASINT crosswalk to Crown taxonomy. RF bins, IR phase, and spectral lines now attached to classes the lab spoke in. Biology wasn't separate from sensors. The sensors defined the biology's path. Polygraph day fell inside this tightening loop. He walked into the exam room with crown in his throat, like a word he wasn't allowed to think. Baseline settled, then the needles twitched at repository, at biological, at redundant copy. The examiner shifted into the careful cadence that asks about stewardship, about off-site mirrors, about how MASINT plays in your workflow. He answered cleanly. He wasn't hiding a drive. He was holding a map in his head. He left cleared and collared, the way a dog leaves a vet with a new chip he can't feel. Back at his terminal, a final detail tipped rumor into ritual. The schema editor shipped a help file for Crown that never rendered in the UI. He caught it in the install logs. Crown.42.storage equals node plus optical. Worm, replicate, 2 coral.verify equals true. It was plain, almost kind. It told him what the system wanted with a calm voice. His sticky note with the hash, and the newer one with the prefix, sat together under a manual that now felt like a lid. He didn't have footage. He didn't have a vial. He had behavior. And behavior, replicated enough times, becomes proof. The polygraph chapter. The morning of the polygraph, he woke before the alarm and lay still counting ceiling screws. Baseline comm is a trick. You fake still water while your mind tosses anchors overboard. He drove in with the SOP phrases looping, immaculate inputs, anomalous biology classification, and rehearsed answers that felt technical but bloodless. I manage metadata. I maintain queues. I don't handle samples. The building smelled like new carpet and coffee. The exam room smelled like gloves. The examiner had the voice of a dentist who knows you're bracing. Strap here, cuff there, sensors blooming across skin that didn't want to confess sweat. Easy questions first, the ones that pain a resting heart. Name, role, years in. Then the drift started, casual on purpose. Do you manage a repository? The needle ticked, not a spike, more like a muscle twitch he tried to iron smooth. Biological in your workspace? His mouth said no while his fingertips cooled. Redundant copy? The question pressed right against the sticky note in his memory. He answered no and stared at a smudge on the wall. What nobody in that room knew was how much vocabulary does the lying. Repository meant 1,000 different things depending on who owned the budget. Biological meant freezer to one person and anomaly code to another. Redundant copy meant a spare drive if you worked help desk and a mirrored ledger if you worked where he did. The machine didn't care about semantics. It cared about skin. The examiner pivoted into stewardship like he'd been waiting. Who else touches your cues? Where do off-site mirrors live? When you say MASINT, define it in your workflow. He dropped the definition the system used, measurement and signature intelligence across RF, IR, spectral, and watched the pen pause at MASINT like it had found a breadcrumb. The next run of questions was tighter, less friendly. Any awareness of special access custodians outside your chain? He said no and meant it, because meaning it was the only way to breathe. He felt the posture shift before he saw it. Examiners have tells too. Shoulders set. Voice thins. Insider threat, not deception. Are you aware of any attempts to bypass purge procedures? No. Have you ever discussed sensitive data with unauthorized personnel? No. Have you ever recorded, retained, or transported sensitive information outside approved systems? He said no again, and let his lungs empty all the way they tell you to when you're leveling a line. The graph settled enough for a nod. Later, a training document would surface under FOIA, a bland PDF that spoke in euphemisms about behavioral indicators during sensitive program screens. It read like stage directions for the hour he'd just lived. Spikes at repository, biological, redundant copy, respiration hitches on off-site mirrors, sweat when asked about chain of custody. He didn't need the document to tell him what his body already had. He left cleared, which sounds like freedom until you notice the leash. Monitoring wasn't a word they used, but it showed up as logins that popped prompts he'd never seen, audits that arrived too precisely after midnight, a supervisor asking kindly if he had any travel planned. He said no. He didn't plan anything beyond the next hour. Meanwhile, something else began chewing the archive from the inside. At first it looked like policy, life cycle deletions, storage hygiene, the stuff you brag about to auditors. Then the timings lined up too neatly with words he'd learned to treat as red flags. Training artifacts queued, then vanished inside windows that didn't match retention schedules. Mirror jobs skipped certain prefixes and declared parity anyway. A human could miss it. A steward couldn't. He caught it in the breath between two routine jobs. A purge kicked off with a note that sounded bureaucratic. Consolidate to anomaly-specific enclaves per updated guidance. He traced the path and watched telemetry stay while imagery moved to a holding bay with a different checksum regime. Biology tags didn't disappear, they changed. IDs, the way you change a street name to throw off an old map. MASINT fields remapped quietly, same channels, new schema. He stared at before and after like a spot the difference puzzle that refuses to admit it's the same picture with the trees moved. Then came the text at 2 a.m., same sender as before. They're pulling the crown rose. He read it twice in the blue light and didn't answer. The next morning, the dashboard showed purge certificates stamped complete with no retention artifacts attached. If someone asked for records next week, the system would shrug. No responsive records. He sat very still and felt the leash tug. He wrote nothing down that day. He only watched. He watched the service accounts log in with scopes his team didn't own. He watched a help ticket close itself with a vendor string that mapped to optical worm arrays. He watched a schema help file change crown to coral in a diff that nobody but him would read. He watched the examiner's pen in his head and wondered if any of this registered as a heartbeat change in a room with rubber tubes. On his desk, the manual hid 2 stickies that now felt like contraband talismans. Old hash, new prefix. He didn't add a third. Not yet. The purge wave had tempo. He needed to hear its rhythm before he tried to step between beats. When the examiner called 3 weeks later for a quick follow-up, he said sure, come by any time, and kept his eyes on the log that said a mirror had just failed Coral Verify by 9 minutes. The same skew he'd remember later when a leak surfaced with 3 JSON fragments and a field that whispered bio.c42.status. Archived, Coral. The 2026 Cull. It didn't start with alarms. It started with politeness. Lifecycle policy refresh, said the banner. Optimize storage hygiene. He'd seen those phrases used 100 times to clear dust. This time they were cover. At 1:17, a clockwork purge kicked off and reached into places normal janitors don't touch. Jobs strobed across queues with the same rhythm. 32 minutes between waves. Like someone was pacing the deletions to watch for echoes. Self-deleting behavior hides by pretending to follow rules. The first clue was the signature mismatch between what the system reported and what it actually did. A purge declared complete, but the ledger that should have captured retention certs stayed blank. He ran a spot check. The telemetry for the same capture still lived. Altitude, vectors, RF bin summaries, parked safely. The imagery didn't. It had been lifted into an enclave labeled anomaly specific, where checksum regimes didn't match anything he had access to. That split was new. Keep the skeleton, move the face. By midweek, a directive landed with the kind of certainty that dares you to blink. Consolidate to anomaly-specific enclaves with air-gapped queues. He read it twice and underlined air-gapped, because that word means sneakernet, hand carry, write once media, the whole ritual you use when you want to leave as little network residue as possible. The note at the bottom was worse. Shift training artifacts to general pools. Certify purge upon supervisory review. The same sleight of hand as before, now scaled and timed. Stewards across corridors started getting orders with gaps where the receipts should live. Purge without retention certificates. Close tickets without attachments. He pinged a colleague who answered with silence and a thumbs-up emoji that felt like a hostage note. If anyone asked later, the system would be able to say, with bureaucratic calm, no responsive records. You can hear that phrase echo in hearing rooms. It lands like a shrug. He mapped the damage the way you map a slow leak. Telemetry legs stayed visible, a comfort of sorts, while imagery and associated frameset manifests queued behind a wall with new prefixes. Biology tags didn't vanish. They were rekeyed to fresh IDs. He traced one chain end to end and watched Crown Point 42 become a different tree entirely. Same behaviors, new names. MASINT fields he could usually count like rosary beads remapped to a new schema, field lengths tweaked, labels softened. RF_anim_bin_count became RF_count. IR_phase_delta shaved to phased. None of it changed the math. All of it broke your old queries. At 2:04 a.m., his phone lit blue. They're pulling the crown rose. Same sender. No punctuation. He stared at the words until his eyes watered, then slid the phone face down and listened to the room. There's a frequency to panic. This wasn't it. This was execution. Meanwhile, a procurement ticket flickered in a vendor portal his team wasn't supposed to see. Optical vault media, worm, bulk order. Write once arrays don't ask for mercy. They give you finality. He matched the part numbers to a vendor datasheet he'd filed after hours and saw the quiet footnote that had unsettled him months earlier. Coral Verify enabled, parity checks by cassette, not by file. The language felt like poetry written by an engineer who hated adjectives. He tried to halt one purge job as a sanity test and ran into a permission that didn't deny so much as reroute. The cancel landed, a new job spawned with a slightly altered name, and the system congratulated him for his diligence. He sat back and let his hands fall off the keyboard. The machine had been taught to eat interruptions. On the Hill, calendars were closing. Oversight windows depend on timing, and timing was now aligned to emptiness. If a subpoena hit during this consolidation, the answers would be neat. No central repository, no consolidated imagery, no evidence of biological holdings. Internally, the paperwork would celebrate improved efficiency. Externally, the phrase would be no responsive records, spoken without a tremor. Across town, he saw the counter-melody. Service accounts began logging in with scopes he couldn't trace to any human. The prefixes he'd memorized started appearing in job names alongside cluster calls he'd only seen in lab-adjacent nodes. Crown became Coral and help texts. Then Coral became plain C42 and change logs posted at 3:11, 9 minutes off the ingest stamps he'd been watching for months. That time skew nagged like a loose tooth. It was either sloppiness or a metronome used as a mask. He wrote nothing new on paper. He opened no new stickies. He learned to watch for power signatures instead. The racks feeding the air-gapped cues drew in spikes, then dipped, then spiked again in a pattern he later overlaid with freight bay scans. The dips matched crate movement. The spikes matched optical writes. If you couldn't see files, you could at least see breath. A microstory slipped through a crack and told him what the dashboards were hiding. The lab tech with the ghost text bumped into him by a vending machine and asked if he'd seen the new carts. New carts? He shrugged. Quieter wheels, the tech said, stirring a cup with a stick. Someone complained about the squeak at night. The man smiled like it was trivia. Then he left, and our steward stood there thinking about how noise, not policy, gets fixed when the work turns nocturnal. He filed a maintenance ticket nobody wanted. Subject, missing retention cert artifacts. Body, standard language, neutral verbs. It closed itself in under a minute with a vendor macro. Refer to Lifecycle Policy Revision 2026 Q2. He forwarded it to a supervisor, who replied at 5:06 with a one-line thanks and no follow-up. If you watched only email, the world was calm. He watched the clock instead. 32 minutes between waves. 9-minute offset on Coral Verify windows. Power dips aligned to crate lifts. MASINT fields remapped but not removed. Telemetry preserved like a skeleton kept for anatomy class while the face was carried somewhere else. The pattern didn't announce where the imagery and the crown rose had gone. But it taught him how to listen for the next prefix. When the last wave of the week hit, he leaned forward and let himself feel angry for the first time. Not because files were gone, because the story was being rewritten in a way designed to make questions sound naive. He took a breath, pressed his thumb against the old label tucked in his manual, and waited. The hash he'd kept would either die here or show up wearing a new name. And if it did, he'd be ready to follow. The surviving hash. It showed up on a Tuesday like it had never left. Same backbone of characters, same improbable collisions of letters and numbers, now fronted by a new suit, IMC/LIR. He didn't cheer. He exhaled. The system had tried to erase the path and in renaming it, admitted it still existed. Lyric wasn't in any glossary, but admins name things when they need to talk without tickets. He heard it in a hallway once, tossed like a joke. Push it to Lyric, and watched two people stop laughing just a little too fast. He checked cluster calls tied to the new prefix and saw a bounce pattern he'd never mapped before. Staging on the East Coast, a quiet handoff inland, and then a route that bent like a radio wave toward a mountain region where the network got hushed. In help text nobody read, a word kept repeating around the LYRQs, acoustic. While that was happening in the racks, something else landed in a metadata field like a breadcrumb with a coffee stain. AC, JM, 24. Acquisition tags tell you how, not what. He traced JM through a maintenance crosswalk and hit a stub that mapped to an intercept in 2024, multi-sensor stack, high-altitude track, a thermal bloom that refused to behave like thrust. MASINT channels listed like a parts catalog, RF anomaly bins, IR phase data, spectral edges that don't belong in a clean sky. If you were writing fiction, you wouldn't make the acronyms that plain. He pulled the old sticky from the manual, wrote LYR beside the IMC, and pressed it back under the spine. Then he did a thing he'd promised himself not to do. He fed a blank label through that offline printer and tapped the keys slow. IMC/LYR plus the hash he'd carried for years. He held the strip until the adhesive warmed under his thumb. He didn't mail it. He wasn't trying to move anything. He was trying to anchor sanity to something he could touch.